Hi everybody, happy October. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Shelby and this is Shebby Reads. I am a femme for butch lesbian who has been with my wonderful butch wife for almost 13 years now. Yay us! If you want to hear more about Sapphic books, please like, comment, and subscribe. And today we're going to be talking about Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu and some Carmilla retellings. Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu came out in 1872 and it is one of the earliest known vampire literatures that we have. It predates Dracula by Bram Stoker by 25 years and there are some similarities between the two. We could talk about that forever, but it's pretty widely recognized that Carmilla did inspire Dracula. Today we are going to be comparing Carmilla with An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson, Hungerstone by Kat Dunn, and My Carmilla is Sapphic Vampire Romance by Anita, Zara. I know one of these things is not like the other, but I do think it was important to pull in a less known work to kind of contrast. So we are going to be comparing and contrasting these books today. Carmilla itself has some very gothic elements, as most classic vampire books do. If you don't know the plot of Carmilla, I would have you click off this video now, just so you know, because we are about to start talking about the original Carmilla. So the original Carmilla centers around this girl named Laura who lives in this Schloss in Austria with her dad and no mom, and she is very excited because one of her friends is supposed to be coming to stay with them. However, she never arrives and Laura is distraught by this. But luckily enough for her, Carmilla and her coach crash nearby and the mother kind of pawns off Carmilla onto this family. Carmilla and Laura end up having this very homoerotic friendship that to me feels very reminiscent of the idea of romantic friendships from the time period before the Victorian era, from about the 1600s to the early 1800s in Europe specifically, and this was written in Europe, so we're talking about Europe, not America. I understand that the Civil War changed some romantic friendship over here and made it last longer. So a lot of people know about this book because it is often accused of kind of originating the predatory lesbian vampire stereotype that we see in a lot of films from like the 60s, 70s, 80s, as well as other spin-offs from this specific book. I would very much argue though that this book subverts that stereotype because Laura is very much desiring of Carmilla without it being vampiric influence. Laura is also having these same romantic feelings even though sometimes she does feel some revulsion. And the relationship is overwhelmingly very romantic, and it's not exactly frowned upon in my opinion that they're women, but that Carmilla's a vampire. Like to me it always felt like the relatives were like, oh, she's a vampire, that's a shame. She was so nice. And there's also a great extent of empathy and sympathy for Carmilla and her being a vampire and her demise from the family at large. Some people might know some of the film adaptations, especially from the 70s, like The Vampire Lovers is the most well-known, I would say, of the film reimaginings. Those films honestly made the stereotype a lot worse, and it's because we were also analyzing this through a modern lens where homophobia was still very prevalent in the 70s, 80s, 90s, obviously still today, but in a very different context. So it kind of made a lot of the assumptions about, I feel, this book worse because people were comparing it to the book in their mind, but they were like, oh, Carmilla's predatory because the movie said so. I think it's important to talk about Carmilla but also understand historical context. So like I said, romantic friendships, which I've read several books about at this point, they were very intense friendships between women from, again, about the 1600s to the 1800s, very early 1800s in Europe. This was 1872, so it's actually not really that far off from the era of romantic friendship. And one of the reasons why romantic friendship kind of fell out of favor is because of Victorian sexual repression, which you would think the period right before that was also like Regency was earlier. Regency also had a very specific kind of sexual repression. So while we still had romantic friendship here in the States for like quite a bit longer through the Civil War because there were less men and it was more socially acceptable, it was still a decently recent change from Europe to this book. And what their relationship reminds me of is very much the romantic friendships of a bygone era. And we do learn that Carmilla is from the 1600s. It was very appropriate for you to passionately declare love for your friend and no one really think much of it. However, we also do know that some people would snidely talk about people being perhaps lesbians through letters. If you read The Passions Between Women, 1666, I think it is, till 1801 by Emma Donoghue, I'm wrong about the years, I'll put it up, that talks a lot more about the actual homophobia that was happening during this time because it wasn't like romantic friendships were completely taken at face value or that they were completely accepted by society. It just wasn't that they were screaming it from the rooftops overall. I also think while we're talking about Carmilla, it's important to talk about the role of the male characters. The male characters, compared to a lot of classic novels, are actually quite useless useless. They are well-meaning but useless. A lot of the plot has to do with Carmilla and Laura specifically, and the men are just kind of well-meaning, like, figures in the background who very much care about Laura. And I think that's important to remember for the other ones we're going to be talking about, because while there are a few men in this book does not center men at all, and it very much is about Carmilla and Laura's relationship and the downfall of that because of the vampirism. And I just want to kind of contrast it with some of the other ones and the male characters also, just because I think it's important. The romance elements, like I said, in this book are very reminiscent of romantic friendship, of Carmilla emphatically and desperately pleading how much she loves Laura and saying it very loudly and proudly for everyone to hear. And I feel like Laura definitely has a more modern Victorian sensibility, even though she's in the middle of nowhere, because she's very much like, don't say that so loud. You can say it, but not so loud. And it was very much reciprocal, and I think people think that it isn't, but it very much is. And I also just want to talk about how when people try to find a villain, I feel like they make Carmilla the villain, but I think overall and overwhelmingly, Victorian sexual repression is the villain of this story. And I think it's very interesting to see how the other, like, retellings kind of approach this as the theme, because I feel like some of the themes are not well developed in some of these, and I think some of them kind of go off onto their own thing, which is fine. It's a retelling. I don't want the exact same thing, otherwise I just read this, but it's still very like, you know, like, I'm worried some people don't understand the original work. That being said, we are now going to talk about our first comparison, which is An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson. Again, this takes place in the 1960s at an all-women's college in Massachusetts. Now, this one is very interesting because it doesn't follow the plot exactly, which I'm totally fine with. Again, I would love to have some different things going on, right? But it does actually feature the predatory lesbian trope, but that trope is not directed toward Carmilla. This added a predatory older teacher trope, which also kind of had a grooming element in my opinion, and I do feel the grooming element was a little bit undercooked. I would have liked to see a little more about that, but honestly, it was still a very good book and it explored it kind of well. I also think the 60s is kind of a great time to bring up sexual repression because it is trying to rebel against the 50s and the messaging in the 50s, but it still was quite a repressive society as a whole. One of the good things about this one also is that Laura is given more agency about being a vampire, while Carmilla is still turned kind of against her will. Laura is given every opportunity to willingly choose to be with Carmilla, and I think that also helps subvert some of the predatory lesbian stereotypes when two of the lesbian characters are able to choose one another. Now, the role of the men in this story, let's talk about it. They are non-existent. Her dad does exist, but I very rarely remember her even talking to him or talking about him. She's very much kind of all consumed by this academic rivalry she has with Carmilla at first. So I felt that it was able to still make kind of like sexual repression and other things the main character without making the men the villain. I'm not saying men can't be the villain. We will talk about it in Hungerstone, but I am saying that there are certain ones on this list that kind of really take a very villainizing approach to the men in Carmilla, which to me is a little bit sad because Carmilla is one of the only classics where the men aren't directly intentionally antagonistic for no reason. One of the other things we have from this book that I just want to mention is that there is a very public sex scene at a party. I didn't hate it. I just want to put that out there. You will hear me talk about a sex scene in one of the other ones and I will complain a bit. However, I don't mind all sex scenes. This one was perfectly fine. Very kinky, but whatever. In this book, we also have the other antagonist, or rather the main antagonist, who is also very possessive of the groomer character. And I kind of feel like that helped kind of the overall theme that was going for as well. Now we're going to quickly talk about what Gothic characteristics this book kept. And we're going to mostly be focusing on European Gothic, not Southern Gothic, for obvious reasons. This book kept the environment of fear. There were murders by a vampire and they couldn't figure out what was going on. I mean, they could a little bit, but they were trying to stop it to a certain extent. There are threats of supernatural events. Again, there are vampires. Another Gothic theme is the intrusion of the past upon the present. I feel that the relationship between the professor and the vampire who's causing most of the problems kind of works for the intrusion of the past upon the present. Another Gothic element is the inclusion of some creepy locations like crypts, dilapidated manors. There is a very creepy school element, but then there is also the crypts. There are some very, very clear crypt scenes, so like we kept that. I will just say overall, I really did enjoy this book. I think it is one of the better Carmilla retellings, and I loved that Laura was given even more agency. I think that that is is a beautiful way to help subvert the predatory lesbian stereotype that we're talking about here today. I would highly recommend this one. Next, we're going to talk about the indie one here, and I promise I am not like shitting on this book purposely. I am just trying to give you my analysis and explain to you why it really wasn't for me as someone who really loves Carmilla. So we're going to be talking about My Carmilla, a Sapphic vampire romance by Anita Zara. This one takes place in the exact same time period as the original with the exact same like setup. I will say that I think it has the gothic elements, but primarily because it completely took the story from the other one and then brought it into their own book. So like hit all of those perfectly fine. This book primarily feels like it inserted a lot of sex because it felt like to me it was like, what if we did Carmilla but there was just a lot of sex? And to me it really didn't help whatever we were going for. And I also feel like a lot of the themes were like, oh, like I think it could have been done well if we had thought about like the Victorian sexual repression, but instead we translated a lot of the issues to modern day, and we will talk about that. This was also a novella, and inserted in between all of the chapters were poetry from someone else who was famous in like the 1800s. That kind of felt icky to me because honestly, it's a novella and I feel like you should be trying to squeeze your own words onto the page as much as possible. And I just feel because of the already stolen plot and setting and everything that using another author's work again was just kind of page filler, and it leans too heavily upon other people's work. We need to talk about the main villain in this adaptation, which is that they really made homophobia and misogyny the villain and the men in Laura's life the villain. They really decided to make the main antagonist be Laura's father, who wants to forcibly marry her off to the general, who is from the original book, and he is quite a bit older than Laura. She is obviously not happy with this. He is kind of a very flat, static villain in a way that I particularly don't enjoy. And then also one of the other villains is the two governesses were given a huge role in this adaptation, and one of them is specifically very religious and bigoted. I think that there is a way to kind of convert some of our issues into the narrative of a work that takes place in the 1800s. However, I just don't think that this one did it super successfully. To me, it just seemed like villainizing the men, making it homophobia and misogyny in the most basic, evil, cackling villain. I'm gonna forcibly marry you off to a man even though you're clearly into Carmilla. It just felt very flat and one note for me. And you all know me on this channel, I do not like to defend men, so also, since this mainly follows the plot of Carmilla, I would just like to talk about Laura's agency within this. I fear that Laura has even less agency almost than she does in the original book. She is very much domineered by the governesses and her father and the men in her life, and then Carmilla just comes in as another assertive, almost she is also a very domineering, very controlling presence. And while there is a scene where they talk about Laura choosing to become a vampire, ultimately it ends with Laura having to become a vampire, and it's not really explained to her super well, and I felt like her agency was really ignored. But I feel like when you're trying to bring in more modern day present themes and then you kind of make the agency very limited, it really does not help your message. I don't know, I just felt like all of the pieces together did not go well with one another. I also feel like it was very much the predatory lesbian stereotype, and I feel like the author of this book was trying to subvert it by implying that Laura would have a choice in an ideal world and that Carmilla very much wanted her to. But at the end of the day, she doesn't really get to choose. And I feel the only reason why Laura is a vampire at the end is so that she can run off with Carmilla. I feel like if she had a more supportive family, there could have been, like she does in the original anyway, there could have been more of a like, we want you to be happy, and like escaping homophobia in the context of like a loving, accepting family structure. Not everyone in the 1800s was a terrible person. Some people were just people and they were family, you know? Just want to briefly talk about that. I don't necessarily mind narrative changes. My problem is like, you need to actively be thinking about why you're doing these things. So like, what was the point of keeping the time period the same? Like, what are you trying to gain from that? What are you trying to say with your book and your work, and why does it really enhance the story? What is the point of making certain people the villains, and are you really departing from the original work, or are you actually staying very close to the original work? If you want to reflect more modern day issues, why don't you make it more of a metaphor rather than like direct one for one like homophobia bad? All in all, I really don't recommend this book, but like it's not the worst retelling of anything I've ever heard, so like it could be worse. Lastly, we're going to talk about Hungerstone by Kat Dunn. This This takes place 16 years after the original Carmilla. The main character Laura's name is changed to Lenore, which is obviously a callback to Edgar Allan Poe's work. Lenore is in her 30s and she is married to a steel baron type guy. I don't know, but he's in charge of like big factories. It's the Industrial Revolution. This one is one of the ones that like I would like to really compare to the last one I just talked about, because the man is the villain, but there is a reason and the themes are done very well. There are huge themes of misogyny within this book, and particularly because she was from a different class but was poor because of her family's gambling choices and the death of her parents, and he is very rich but he wants to be more in like the upper crust of society with like the lorded landed people in England. And so there is a power differential, and he is always angry about that, and he is always, in my opinion, trying to keep her down, trying to like use her, but she doesn't give him everything he wants, so he's like awful to her. There's also a lot about like reproductive issues because she hasn't given him an heir. So Carmilla shows up very much the same way, crash with the carriage, they help her, then she can't leave because she is too ill to do so. However, this one very much subverts the predatory lesbian stereotype, because while Carmilla is off-putting and kind of pushy to a certain extent, she is really trying to push Lenore to see things for what they are, to see things in a certain way, to question why, to be able to want things and take them for yourself for the first time ever. But there is always the element of Lenore having a choice, and that is very important to the story. I will say in this one, I also think that there might not have been any vampirism at all. It was very unclear, and there was a lot of like biting, but there's no clear evidence that it truly is vampirism. The gothic themes were very well executed. We were at a dilapidated ancient manor that they had purchased. There was also a lot of good like paranoia, and there was some spoilers here, poisoning, and the way the poisoning was done, it really reminded me of Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, which was very good. I thought that this book did a good job overall subverting some of the stereotypes where Carmilla is kind of a driving force, but she is not being a predatory lesbian, because Lenore's agency is firmly established quite well in my opinion, and Carmilla literally leaves for a good chunk of the book, so it's Lenore figuring herself out. I thought that the rejection of the patriarchy without villainizing the original men characters from the story was really great. I think creating a new separate man really worked well, and I feel like it also makes the most sense because other than fathers, like husbands asserted authority over women in that time period over and over and over. And this book had a very good, like, good for her ending, so take that as you will. Now I know there are more Carmilla retellings out there, so please in the comments below tell me what your favorite Carmilla retellings are. I would love to do another like compare and contrast video. I really adore Carmilla. It's one of my favorite books of all time. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe share this to someone you think would like it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!